Okay, so I think the participant is already here. For the participant can be entered to join us, and then I will start it. We'll start it. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our international workshop series. And first of all, allow me to extend my warmest welcome for you all to the international workshop series, the Gastroenterology Research Opportunities in Antimicrobial Resistant Metagenomic Clinical Surveillance and Wet Lab Experiments. Uh, Today, this workshop is hosted by Helicobacter pylori and Microbiota Study Group, Institute of Tropical Disease, University of Airlangga. And we are honored to present you this workshop. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Judith Anissa, and I will be the Master of Ceremonies today for today's workshop. And recently, due to the global pandemic, most of all university office and other public places are being temporarily shut down and closed. However, for students, lecturers, and other academicians, they continue their education through online learning and studying from home in order to improve their knowledge. With this online workshop, the excellent speakers will share their updated knowledge regarding gastroenterology research opportunities in antimicrobial resistance, metagenomic surveillance, and wet lab experiments. Before we open our international workshop together, let's sing Indonesian national anthem. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to proceed to our main agenda for today's. And the first honorable speaker for today is Professor David Graham. Before we start, let me introduce our honorable speaker. Let me share his curriculum vitae. So Professor Graham, or Professor David is a class professor that has a high index corpus of 134, and the total number of publication, the number is very humongous, and this is very make us very proud that he become one of our teacher in our study group is 1,133 with the total number of citation 75,031. And his research interest is the interaction of infectious agent and the gastrointestinal tract for the gastrointestinal effect of NSAID, peptic disease, and Helicobacter pylori, also the viral gastroenteritis. And he is also reviewer for many famous journal and the member of editorial boards and also the editor-in-chief himself for the Helicobacter journal. And he has many national and international appointments and the academic appointments, especially in the national in Hong Kong and also in Baylor College Medicines. It's very famous in the world also, BCM. And also he is the professor of molecular virology and microbiology in BCM, the VA medical centers. And with no further time, we are pleasure to invite Professor Graham to present his lecture today. Professor, the time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can share the screen. Not yet. Okay. Try again. Well, nothing seems to work properly. There we go. Can you see that?
Yes, very clear, Professor.
Okay. Well, today we're going to talk about Vaniprosium containing H. pylori therapies. And this is part of the future. It's a little bit premature to be giving a talk on this topic before all the studies are in. And there's a study going on now in the US and Europe to see how these drugs work in that situation. But we have a pretty good idea that what's going to happen, and we can discuss what's known and where I think we are and what the future will be. First, disclosures. I'm a consultant to Red Hill Biopharm and to Fathom Pharmaceuticals for novel H. pylori therapies and to Otsuka Japan over novel breath tests. My aims tonight, this morning, actually are to update H. pylori therapy in relationship to this new PCAB, Vaniprosium, and discuss antimicrobial stewardship, which we're moving towards as our way of practicing medicine for Helicobacter, and to make some specific recommendations. Let's start with really a key moment. And that in 2015, the Kyoto Global Consensus report on H. pylori was published. And this, for the first time, defined H. pylori gastritis as an infectious disease. And that really changed things, because up to that time, it had been a gastrological disease. And the treatment of GI diseases and infectious diseases are different. You know, gastroenterology diseases are of unknown etiology mostly and have high placebo response to therapy. And infectious diseases are known etiology and have no placebo response. So really the approach to them should be different. And the second point that they made was that anybody with the infection, H. pylori infected individuals, should be offered eradication therapy unless there are really strong reasons not to. And we know the benefits of H. pylori eradication. We know that H. pylori causes gastric cancer and peptic ulcer disease, malt lymphoma, And to eliminate the infection will basically eliminate gastric cancer and markedly reduce peptic ulcer disease. It causes functional dyspepsia, causes atrophic gastritis, B12 deficiency, iron deficiency anemia, idiopathic thrombocytopenia. All those are causative, and we can eliminate or change the frequency of those diseases, at least those related to H. pylori, by eradicating that infection. Now, it is an infectious disease, and therefore we can cure it with antibiotics. And if we cure the infection, we, of course, alter the natural history of any H. pylori associated disease. And treatment of any infectious disease with antibiotics is not and should not be complicated. We have made it unnecessarily too highly complicated, and we'll talk about how we can simplify that going forward. The first question is who should we test for H. pylori? And there have been several consensus conferences that have looked at that in some detail. The first was the Houston Consensus Conference in 2018. At least ask who in the United States should be tested for Helicobacter pylori, with the idea that anytime it's positive, they should be treated. So the recommendations included testing and treatment for everybody with active H. pylori infection, with current or past gastric or duodenal ulcer, for a family history of peptic ulcer disease, because we know this infection runs in families, for people with uninvestigated dyspepsia, gastric malt lymphoma, or family history of gastric cancer, because again, that's caused by Helicobacter and that runs in families. Then more broadly, family members living in the same household of patients with a proven active infectious H. pylori infection. So that means when you find one case, you test the rest of the family. And in America, many of the cases come from immigrants from high prevalence areas. So any first generation immigrant from a high prevalence area should be suspected of having H. pylori and should be tested to prevent them from getting the diseases that they would subsequently have, like gastric cancer. And other ethnic groups in the United States, like Latinos and African Americans, that are at high risk because they still have a high proportion with Helicobacter. Now, at the last year, we did the Taipei Global Consensus, and this one is focused on screening and treatment for gastric cancer prevention. So it's really focused on the whole world, but particularly those countries which have a high rate of gastric cancer. So they recommended screening and eradication of H. pylori for gastric cancer prevention in any population with a high incidence or high risk of gastric cancer. And screening and eradication of H. pylori before the development of atrophic gastritis and intestinal metaplasia. The population-wide screening and eradication of H. pylori should be integrated or included in the national health care priorities so to optimize results. Of course, some countries, the gastric cancer may be common, but it's the least of their problems. They point out again that young individuals are going to benefit the most because not only do you cure the gastritis, but it reduces their risk of gastric cancer and it reduces the transmission within families, so not their children then don't get it. And the strategy of screen and treat for H. pylori infection is most cost effective in young adults for gastric cancer prevention in regions with a high incidence of gastric cancer. Now, this is my thought about how we choose therapy today. You go to see a doctor, you have an H. pylori, and they have a group of therapies that they might give you, and they just give you one. And you say, what is that based on? And the answer was, well, I'm not sure. And we'll talk about how to make that sure. So the first rule using antimicrobial stewardship would to be only use optimized therapies. Optimized means a therapy that reliably produces a high cure rate, say 95%, in susceptible infections with adherent patients. In infectious disease, you don't treat resistant infections with antibiotics you know they're resistant to. And in gastroenterology, we do. It does not administer antibiotics to which the local H. pylori are likely to be resistant. And it uses only experimentally proven optimal formulations, including the dosing intervals, and the duration of therapy. Now we know conceptually that every effective infectious disease therapy is susceptibility based. You say, well, I don't have susceptibility testing, but you actually do, because there's several ways that we can measure susceptibility. We'll come back to that briefly. But we do know that susceptibility-based therapy is effective everywhere. So if I tell you that my therapy works in my population and we have this pattern of susceptibility, it will work in another population the same way. We may need to make a few minor differences, such that doses may be different, duration of therapy may be different, but it would be an ideal therapy anywhere that you have the same susceptibility. Now, systemic reviews and meta-analysis have looked at the prevalence of antibiotic resistance in the world. And resistance to clarithromycin, metronidazole, and levofloxacin is pretty much universal. Almost every WHO region has higher level resistance, with metronidazole resistance being the most prevalent. And that means we really cannot use clarithromycin, metronidazole, and levofloxacin, at least as triple therapies, as an empiric therapy any longer. The primary resistance to amoxicillin, tetracycline, and rifabutin is still low, except in some very unusual situations. So we have those drugs really to use without worrying too much about susceptibility, unless we know that's in our population. Now, how do we assess whether we have resistant or susceptible populations? Now, traditional method is a direct method. You take the organism, you culture it, and do susceptibility testing. The modern method would be molecular detection of resistance causing mutations, which gives you basically the same information. But most of the world has to still use indirect methods because they either don't have culture and susceptibility and they can't afford molecular detection. So the indirect method that we use is test of cure. And for decades, we've been doing test of cure, which means after the infection has been treated, we wait for 4 weeks, and then we test whether or not the infection was cured. And that data is critical because if the infection was not cured, it's most likely either the patient didn't take the medicine or they were resistant. So this is how you find what your level of resistance is in your population without having susceptibility tests available. So test of cure is 4 more weeks after the end of therapy. You do a test to confirm the absence of the infection. We prefer non-invasive tests like the stool antigen or real breath test. And resistance is highly likely when the patient has a positive test after therapy with a proven reliable, effective regime, and the patient's adherent to therapy. Now, interesting, people have collected these data. There's one center that for 19 years collected the data and actually published that their cure rate with clarithromycin triple therapy was persistently between 70 and 75%. And so, I mean, that's just how foolish we were. We were collecting the data and we weren't thinking about it or using it without recognizing that each year we collected that data, it told us we were doing the wrong thing. But we take a long time to learn. People are, we're all slow. The correct choice of antibiotics is always local, or it's even local to the individual. So we must know the local resistance pattern. So we should ignore recommendations and consensus conference that are not based on data from your population. And you should not use clarithromycin, metronidazole, or levofloxacin triple therapies unless you know the infection is susceptible. And who should decide about what the therapy consists of? The doses, the durations, the drugs. It should be experiments. It should not be pharma, and it should not be governments. And in many cases, the decisions are made by pharma. They develop a therapy that's not very good, and they sell it instead of going back to develop a therapy that does work. In traditional infectious disease, the therapy's worked out, proven to be optimal, and then it's sold. Antibiotic stewardship. This is the new way we're moving, and slowly and with great difficulty, because one of the things you lose when you start thinking this way is you lose the use of a meta-analysis, because meta-analysis is aimed at the average therapy and you're trying to identify the best therapy. So empiric therapies should be restricted to those proven highly effective locally, because any therapy that works locally is functionally susceptibility based, because it's really based on your data from that population. Indirect microbial susceptibility data, test of cure data, should always be collected and should be shared. And your agency that's responsible for monitoring resistance of all the other antibiotics should be collecting this data and delivering it back to you. They're saying, at least in our population, this therapy doesn't work. So you know what not to use or what to use. And local outcomes should be used to choose local therapy. Okay, what therapies are now obsolete? Shouldn't use them unless you know the patient has susceptible infection. So clarithromycin, metronidazole, and levofloxacin triple therapies out the window. Concomitant therapy, PPI, clarithromycin, amoxicillin, metronidazole. Sequential therapy. And we're going to talk about one today, Vaniprosium, clarithromycin, amoxicillin, triple therapy. Just becoming available for us, already obsolete. Now, we'll talk about antibiotics and antisecretory drugs. We use antisecretory drugs with antibiotics. So one of the questions would be, which antisecretory drug? And Vaniprosium is an antisecretory drug. It's really a super PPI. So which PPI and at what dose is best? Because right now people say, I gave a PPI and clarithromycin. Well, that doesn't really count. You really need to know what you were trying to accomplish. Now, this was a study that we did analysis of data that looked at the relative effectiveness of the different PPIs, pantoprazole, omeprazole, lansoprazole, esomeprazole, rabiprazole. And you can see that for given once a day, and the doses on the bottom, the relative doses, as if they were given as only as omeprazole. It went from about 40% of the time the pH is below 4 to up to about 65%. It varied, and it was reliable and it was linear. When you gave it twice a day, it increased remarkably. Went from the low of high of 65 to the low of about 65, up to about 80%. And if you went to TID, the line overlapped BID entirely. So there's no advantage of going with higher doses or with TID or QID. You get your full bang for your buck with twice a day therapy. And if you want, for example, if you gave twice a day pantoprazole, you'd be equal to once a day 40 milligrams of esomeprazole. Now here are the data, if you look at them now in omeprazole equivalents. So how many times have you had a patient where they were taking, say, 20 milligrams of omeprazole and they weren't feeling very well? So you switched them to 40 milligrams of pantoprazole and they got better. Well, 40 milligrams of pantoprazole is equal to 9 milligrams of omeprazole. So you went from 20 milligrams to 9. And the patients got better. It just shows you that it wasn't rational. It's using it as psychiatry medicines. So 40 milligrams is 9 milligrams of omeprazole. And when you go up, you can see the maximum is rabiprazole at 40 milligrams is 72 milligrams. Now, omeprazole understood that. They recognized that 40 milligrams of omeprazole was equal to 64 milligrams of omeprazole. So when they did their comparative studies, they always did them against pantoprazole. So 40 of pantoprazole versus 40 of omeprazole sounded like they were the same, but they were remarkably different. And so they could beat them. They couldn't beat 20 milligrams of omeprazole, but they could beat 40 milligrams of pantoprazole. So it was all smoke and mirrors. So what do we say about dosing? Well, we say that we prefer to give about 40 milligrams of omeprazole BID. So that could be 20 milligrams of rabiprazole, or 20 milligrams of esomeprazole, or maybe 45 milligrams of lansoprazole. And we go to high dose PPI, we go to either one of the 40 milligrams of esomeprazole or rabiprazole. And you go any higher, it doesn't give you any more benefit. So that's the way we should be thinking about the PPI when we're treating with at least amoxicillin-containing therapies. Now let's go back to pantoprazole. We should ignore it. We should avoid it. It's not a bad drug, but it's just a bad drug for H. pylori therapy. Because as you see, if you want to give 40 milligrams of pantoprazole, you'd have to give 180 milligrams per dose of pantoprazole. So it's just not practical. Now we come to this new drug, Vaniprosium. Here we see the parietal cell, and this is a competitive inhibitor of the potassium channel. It's a hydrogen potassium channel. So this is, it's not the only drug in this class, but it's the only one available and the only one that's gotten as far. So it's a first in class of the potassium competitive blockers. So it's a PPI. It inhibits the hydrogen potassium ATPase, but it's reversible and it works in a potassium competitive manner. It's very strong. It's got approximately 350 times more potent inhibitory effect than, for example, lansoprazole. So it has another effect. It's long lasting. So if you give it in the morning, you still have a good effect the next morning. So it lasts a long time. And the parietal cell does not have to be activated. For a proton pump inhibitor to work, the parietal cell has to be acidic. And so you stimulate it, give it before breakfast. So as soon as you eat, the parietal cell stimulated and you inhibit it. This one does it whether they're inhibited, they're stimulated or not. So it's got a lot of significant potential advantages, and it's less affected by the genetic polymorphism. So it's a stronger PPI. Now PPIs are also pretty strong. So does a stronger PPI make a difference? Now here we see it in experiments, Vaniprosium versus esomeprazole. Here's the molecular structure of Vaniprosium. And we have two doses here. We have Vaniprosium 20 milligrams once a day and twice a day. Esomeprazole 20 milligrams daily, that's 32 milligrams of omeprazole equivalent, or BID, so still 32 milligrams of omeprazole equivalent. And we can see the black lines, hard black lines, here is the Vaniprosium. And this one down here is the 32 milligram equivalent of omeprazole. So you see these are better. And this is a pH above 5. Normally we see pH above 4 because it's stronger than either one. But it's not that much different than 20 milligrams of omeprazole when you look at this graph. But it's clearly comes on earlier, lasts longer. See, there's not dips on both ends. So if you look back at our curve, here's omeprazole, Vaniprosol. It's 100% on our pH 4 all day long. So it's got some advantages on acid control. How does that relate to advantages on healing or curing Helicobacter pylori? Now here's the original study. This study is very interesting because this is the one that showed that Vaniprosium was better than PPI with the clarithromycin triple therapy. When you look at it in detail, you see that in the patients with susceptible infections, they were identical. So there was no advantage of Vaniprosium versus lansoprazole for susceptible infections. The difference was in resistant infections, because in the resistant infections, the PPI amoxicillin cured 40%, whereas the Vaniprosol amoxicillin cured 82%. So the difference was that the clarithromycin resistance was overcome, but it wasn't overcome. It was that it wasn't necessary. And so when you look, and I'll show you the data, how effective it is Vaniprosium triple therapy in HP, and for susceptible infections with triple therapies, the PPI and Vaniprosium were equivalent. But it was more effective in enhancing the dual therapy than was a PPI. So it's much more effective for PPI plus amoxicillin. The duration of therapy with Vaniprosium could be a little less because you get a full effectiveness on day one. With the PPI, it takes 3 or 4 days for it to get full effect. So if you give a 10-day PPI, you're really giving about 7 days of effective therapy. And so theoretically, you could possibly reduce the duration of therapy. For resistant infections, Vaniprosium is superior to standard dose PPI, but there's a big but, and we'll look about that big but. So we see again, if we had done that same experiment and we had given amoxicillin plus clarithromycin, we got 92%. Now, if we took away the resistant patients, you got 98%. So this was with this level of resistance. But if you saw you cured 80% with just the PPI and the amoxicillin. So now you ask, what was the benefit of the clarithromycin? What did you gain by giving everybody clarithromycin? And the answer was 88% of the patients got clarithromycin unnecessarily. This is one of our basic rules. You don't give a drug that they're resistant to. So only 12% benefit. So when you calculate, you're going to find out this is a real problem in actually enhancing global antimicrobial resistance being done because we're doing this because we got a little benefit here that we attributed to the therapy, but was actually due to this. So what you would say was, in a logical sense, was I just need to improve this. What does it take to get this up to there? And it can be done, and we'll look at that in a minute. So here's our issues with antibiotic misuse. In Japan, where they use 7-day low-dose clarithromycin, for every 1 million treatments, they equal to at least 1,400 kilograms of unnecessary clarithromycin. In the US, if we use higher doses and longer treatment, it would be 14,000 kilograms of unnecessary clarithromycin per million treatments. And they do more than 1 million treatments right now in Japan. So this is really not an appropriate use of that antibiotic, because all it does is contribute to global antibiotic resistance. You could leave it out and get pretty much the same results. So Vaniprosium does not overcome or reduce clarithromycin resistance. Either clarithromycin resistance, metronidazole resistance, or quinolone resistance. It appears to improve any therapy that has amoxicillin because it improves amoxicillin dual therapy component of any triple therapy. So it reliably improves the outcome with any acid-sensitive antibiotic, which would be amoxicillin, fluoroquinolones, and clarithromycin. And it potentially allows us to reliably use amoxicillin dual therapy. Now, there's some problems in Japan doing experiments, because in Japan, the government tells you what are the doses and durations that they will reimburse. So you can't go do an experiment on 14-day therapy when they only reimburse 7. So you're stuck. So that's an example of the government making the decisions instead of the science making the decisions. So what's the future look like? Well, the future, I think, is going to be PPI amoxicillin, with the PPI will be Vaniprosium. This first was proposed in 1989 by a fellow named Peter Unge. And the most bunch of recent studies, the one at first in 2015 got everybody's attention, was one by Dr. Yang from Taiwan, who showed that high dose dual therapy was a superior therapy. He could get over 90% cure rates with high dose dual therapy with amoxicillin and PPI. But it was difficult, and it required patients to eat a low acid diet, etc. When you tried it in different populations, it turned out to be unreliable. In some populations, particularly Asian populations where people are smaller and the gastric acid secretion is less, and the PPIs are not destroyed by CPY as quickly as they are in Western populations, it works much better. In America, with our big people and big gastric acid secretion, it's almost impossible to get that gastric pH above 6 and keep it there. So when we do those therapies, we get 50 and 60% cure rates instead of 90% cure rates. But it can be done with Vaniprosium. So the future says that there's this new drug, Vaniprosium, and it can sustain high intragastric pH. If you give enough, you can keep the pH above 6. And if you keep the pH above 6, the bacteria multiply. And when they multiply, they're killed by amoxicillin. When the pH is below 6, they don't multiply, and so therefore they can become dormant and they can ride through amoxicillin, which is one of the reasons we give long duration. So when they come out to multiply, you're ready there with your antibiotic. The issues are the doses and duration of therapy. And then really the doses are of, we think of amoxicillin, and the duration of therapy is probably going to be 14 days. So most likely the ideal regime for dual therapy in most places will be Vaniprosium 20 milligrams BID and amoxicillin 1 gram TID or 750 milligrams QID for 14 days. And at least in my hands, that works remarkably well. But like all drug combinations, it needs to optimize. And that means you have to optimize the drugs, the doses, the dosing intervals, the formulations, the duration of therapy, etc. For example, in China, Lu Hong gives the PPIs 30 minutes before meals and the antibiotics 30 minutes after meals, and she gets some remarkably good results. Is that due to her timing of the therapy, or is it something else? We don't know. It just means we really need to do the experiments, and there's no better place to do those experiments than Indonesia, because you've got lots of infected patients. So the conclusion of that part says that Vaniprosium triple therapy is really a poor choice for an empiric therapy. And they're selling it because that's what they have to sell. And it promotes misuse, overuse of clarithromycin, as most do not receive any benefit from receiving that drug. So we know the Vaniprosium amoxicillin dual therapy. We know with a PPI, it requires a high dose of PPI, which would be 40 milligrams of esomeprazole twice a day, plus amoxicillin every 6 to 8 hours for 14 days. Not successful in Western countries, and for those with high acid outputs, it's reduced effectiveness by smoking, etc. In Japan, a 7-day Vaniprosium BID with amoxicillin can give 90% cure rates. And that's been shown. But it can't do better, muchly. So the correct problem is the duration is too short, or the doses are too little, or both. And so those are simple experiments that just have to be done. They're difficult to do in Japan. You could do all those experiments tomorrow in Indonesia. So conclusion, Vaniprosium clarithromycin triple therapy is currently only marginally better than Vaniprosium amoxicillin dual therapy. It's a poor choice in high clarithromycin resistant populations, and 4 out of 5 patients do not receive any benefit from having received clarithromycin, where Vaniprosium amoxicillin dual therapy can be improved by increasing the frequency of amoxicillin to TID or QID. We prefer QID, increasing the dosage, the duration of therapy, or preferably both. So 14 days, QID 750 QID is what we use. You have a smaller population, you could probably get by with a lower dose of amoxicillin. So what does the future look like? Well, the future comes from Japan, and it looks like amoxicillin Vaniprosium dual therapy. And so that's what I see as the future of how this new drug will integrate into what we're doing today. It's first been disruptive because it did a study that appeared to work, but had a major downside. And we have to recognize that downside and discover how to make it work with no downside, but only with good upside. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Graham. This was a very interesting presentation because this drug is very new and it opens our knowledge and new side of point of view for treating the Helicobacter pylori. And I think all the participants also agreed. And if there are any question, you feel free to ask Professor Graham, and you can write down your question in the Q&A forum, and we will discuss after the second speaker. And for the next speaker, I would like to introduce you to our also remarkable speakers. Let me share his CV. Okay, maybe Professor Graham can end your sharing screen so we can proceed. Thank you so much, Professor. And the next speaker is Dr. Muhammad Miftahusuru. He is also our famous speaker in Indonesia. Okay. Wait a minute. Okay. Excuse me. Let me take the time to open his CV. Okay, so this is Dr. Muhammad Miftahusuru. We know him as Dr. Miftah here in Indonesia. He is founder and Microbiota Study Group in Institute of Tropical Disease, University of Airlangga. He has a high index of Scopus 16 with the total number of publication around 80 and the total number of citations 657. He is now also a vice president for University of Airlangga, the vice rector for internationalization, digitalization and information. He is also have a degree for a PhD in Oira University and also a postdoctoral in PCM with Professor Graham also. And also he is a specialist from internal medicine in University of Airlangga. He has many achievements. One of them is become the high quality scientific articles from our Ministry of Research in Indonesia. And also he has achievement in most quartile 1 publication, the second rank most citation lectures from University of Airlangga, Satya Lencana Karya Satya for 10 years from President of Indonesia. And his research experience is a learning from Indonesia, the world's highest COVID-19 death rate, gastrointestinal system, hepatobiliary and pancreas. Many research in Helicobacter pylori, of course, about the validation test, the analysis of gastric microbiota and its relationship with antibiotic resistance. And also he has experience in cancer of colon cancer detection, and also the pioneer of epidemiology molecular Helicobacter pylori research in Indonesia. So without no more further time, I proceed Dr. Muhammad Miftahusuru to present his lecture today. Dr. Miftah, the time is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Very proud to be a speaker together with my lovely teacher, Professor Graham. He is very famous as one of the invention of urea breakfast, as we know. And also he is one of the highest H index that I know in H. pylori area. So it is my pleasure, and of course I'm not equal with him because H index 16 is not similar with 136. I hope I'm not wrong. So, but I try to become a best presentation today, and I'm really remember that in the probably in the 3 months ago or 4 months ago, during I published the new publications about Vaniprosium, also with the in the top tier journal. However, Professor Graham emailed to me that I have another concept about Vaniprosium, and then it is very I mean interesting to discuss with him today, because although in Japanese, although in also in Indonesian, they have a very hard, I mean, really think the vonoprazan is become the future drugs. However, Professor Graham mentioned before that with some note and also with some distinguished problem as like as the clarithromycin high resistance area. Okay, I try to make presentation today that how the strategy for H.pylori eradication in Indonesia and what distinguishes it from countries with high gastric cancer incidence. We know that Helicobacter pylori is a human pathogen that is successful for associated several diseases such as dyspepsia, peptic ulcers, and gastric cancer. As usually, Professor Graham mentioned about me that we are from the prevalence in pylori in Indonesia, low prevalence of gastric cancer. However, I sometimes they invite me from the country with the low prevalence of H. pylori and gastric cancer. So it is, I think, instructive to compare these prevalence rates and determining the factors with those of the countries with high gastric cancer incidence. It is the gastric cancer incidence and also prevalence of H. pylori, and we can see some ASEAN countries have high prevalence of H. pylori, such as South Korea and also Japan and also some China and Vietnam, of course, with the around 25, although in the Southeast Asia. However, most of the Southeast Asia, especially with the Malay ethnic source, the main source is Singapore, Malaysia, and also Indonesia. And here, in the black box, show that the prevalence of H. pylori is also low, with gastric cancer incidence is also low. So, as the previous mentioned in the previous lecture, that the H. pylori in Indonesia is very controversial previously, and then we decided to make the new study, and we confirmed that prevalence H. pylori only 22.1%. And actually, recently we tried to write the full concept of the prevalence of H. pylori in Indonesia, including East part of Indonesia, and we concluded that the East part Indonesia have more risk to get the H. pylori infection rather than the western part, except the Batak ethnic area. So with this area, probably it is very interesting to make several recommendations. How about in the Indonesian problem? So actually, we try to analyze each disease. So we're starting with dyspepsia and gastritis. Based on the previous publications by the expert in Indonesia, show that this dyspepsia probably presented in 25% of Indonesian populations. So why it is very interesting, we know that the dyspepsia is associated with H. pylori, and also H. pylori is means dyspepsia. It is the fact in other countries. However, we know that our prevalence is only 2.8%. So what's happened with Indonesian population? So why in this year our in this 22 our group is the published about the gastric microbiota in Helicobacter, that because we thinking this probably importance or associated with the gastric microbiota, and I will explain in the last slide. And also that we try to make the big study with 1,139 endoscopic patients, and we found that the main factor is acute and chronic gastric mucosal inflammations, regardless of ethnicity and geographical locations. So based on the Kyoto consensus, and also the Professor Graham mentions that the important role H. pylori infection in the progression of gastric inflammation, even in the area with low prevalence H. pylori infection. It is suggested that we have to make eradications of H. pylori, and including in also Indonesia. And how about the peptic ulcer? Our nationwide surveys with 17 cities in Indonesia, we found 77, only 6.76% patient had the sign of ulceration. Said ulceration, although it is not very malignant ulceration, only the superficial ulceration. And we know that gastric ulcer has the highest risk to become gastric cancer, while the duodenal ulcer was less likely. And in the Japan, that the gastric ulcer was likely found as pylori positive. Although in Korea, 23.9% H. pylori infected patient has gastric ulcer. However, in Indonesia, if we found only H. pylori positive patients, the gastric ulcer also increased in the 11.3%. So it is also very interesting that even though the total number of gastric ulcer in Indonesia may be lower than Japan, we still need to be cautious that the causes that the treating the patient in some specific ethnic. I will show that some of the ethnic have a gastric cancer risk index rather than other ethnic. So it is very important to know that and also concern and focusing only in the specific ethnics with higher infection prevalence rather than the only in general prevalence of H. pylori. How about the influence of influence factors that we know that in fact there was no intact long time duct. So probably it is need the more analysis in the next study. However, we know that the most difficult is the prevalence very low. So it will be difficult for us to check rather than the H. pylori get the strengths. I mean that from the most region in Indonesia, except for I thought before that we really focus in the area with the high gastric cancer risk. How about the gastric cancer? We know that intraabdominal gastritis, it will be increase the gastric acid production and resulting a high flow acid to duodenum and also metaplasia in the duodenum. And also the fact that H. pylori infection and high acid exposure are destructive, leading to duodenal ulcer. All the duodenal ulcer and also gastric cancer is also still the controversial correlation. And there is the disruption of acid production in parietal cell is also one of the most theory about the hypochloronic acid theory, and also Professor Graham is the one famous researcher about the gastric cancer. So reduced acidity cause increase of H. pylori infection both in corpus and also in antrum, increasing risk of developing gastric ulcer and gastric eradications. How about the Indonesia? Indonesian population had most the antrum predominant gastritis, and it is predominant in patients with chronic gastritis. So actually, although corpus predominant gastritis is associated with high incidence of gastric cancer in Indonesia, however, the prevalence is also not so high rather than antrum predominant. In Malaysia, in other ASEAN countries, the gastric ulcer is lower in Indonesia rather than, for example, in India and Malaysia. And the some ethnic, such as Timor ethnic, and also with the especially H and H. pylori infection, are independent risk factor for atrophic gastritis, and Timor ethnicity had the highest gastric cancer risk. So even though Indonesia is country with the low risk of gastric cancer, probably severe gastric cancer mucosal condition was observed in several ethnic, and this is suggested the policymakers in Indonesia should pay attention in special ethnic, such as including the Timor ethnic. So as I explained before, actually Indonesia has less virulent genotypes in predominant strains. However, this result actually little biased because most of the strains come from several ethnics that have the highest prevalence of H. pylori in Indonesia. Therefore, the East Asian type KE with 6 base pair deletion actually is very typical in Batak ethnic, and also APYT motif. And however, we found this previous publication, we found that the East Asian type KE with 6 base pair deletions had very lower, although rather than Western type KE in H. pylori Indonesia. And this is the predominant virulence factor in Indonesian strains. Although we found the true virulence factors we call OIP-OND, and also FACE-S1M1, S1M1 with 97.7%. So actually, we although we believe that also the virulence factor is also low, or less virulence factors. However, we found that true virulence factors such as IBA also on in Indonesian population, and it is one of the our groups, Dr. Langen published about integrating conjugative elements of H. pylori, and he found that HPTFS is the more virulent strains of H. pylori. Of course, it is also influenced with intact pi. It is if intact pi with HPTFS positive, these strains will be more infected rather than non-intact pi of negative strains. And we starting about H. pylori infection that the Asia actually in the 2008 declared about the first line treatment. This is about amoxicillin and clarithromycin twice daily, and also about metronidazole and also amoxicillin as the first line of therapy, and with the decided with the bismuth and also levofloxacin and also rifabutin as second line regimen therapy. And also in the Maastricht 5 in the Florent consensus report, they mentioned about bismuth containing quadruple therapy as the high for the treatment in the high dual clarithromycin and also metronidazole resistant. And how about if clarithromycin resistant 15 until 40%, but low intermediate metronidazole resistant means less than 40%. So non-bismuth quadruple concomitant therapy prescribed for 14 days probably can be effective alternative. So the last, I think Professor Graham also in here, that Helicobacter pylori management in ASEAN or the Bangkok consensus report. In we can see in the statement 18 that amoxicillin and tetracycline resistance is low and stable, and metronidazole resistance is generally high in ASEAN countries. I think it is true that our metronidazole resistance is very low. So they suggested that clarithromycin resistance has been increasing and reduced the eradication of standard triple therapy. However, in some experience of our researchers found that the standard triple therapy still had benefit with the clarithromycin as the H. pylori prevention and eradication. However, I will be explain in the next slide. If the clarithromycin resistance is high when it exceeds 10 until 15%, which spreads region into high and low resistant area. I think it is very good idea that we will show that probably Indonesia could use this statement as the main purpose. And also in the statement 2014, this duration is optimal and should be used. I think 14 days because we don't have any experiment with the clinical trials in Indonesia due to the low H. pylori prevalence. Probably it is we have to believe that 14 days duration is optimal in use. And as I explained before, that probably it is very difficult, although antibiotic susceptibility test is very difficult because, and also high cost. In previous publication, I mentioned that although I need more than 3 years to get 1,000 samples, and mostly the sample is from Javanese, that the very low H. pylori of H. pylori. So therefore, it is very difficult to do the more epidemiologic study if only mention about the pylori. So it is the antibiotic resistance in Indonesia. We show that the clarithromycin as the Bangkok consensus. We see that the probably if we can spirit it, the Java and also Bali, probably other island of, for example, the Borneo and also Papua, probably although for 14 near with the 15%, and also Sulawesi, Sumatra, and Timor had the prevalent antibiotic resistance in the less than 15%. So probably we can spirit it and in this special area, especially in the Sulawesi, Sumatra, and Timor, we can still use the triple therapy or based on the clarithromycin therapy. And also we can see how about the amoxicillin. The amoxicillin only probably Papua is high, and however the metronidazole only the Timor and also Borneo and also the Bali have less than 40%. So probably we can use the quadruple therapy non-bismuth in this area with the low or intermediate metronidazole therapy. How about levofloxacin? Probably it is very difficult because only some area have less than 20%, but mostly have more than 30%. And then levofloxacin, I think it's probably is difficult to use in Indonesia. So, however, the this prevalence of antibiotic resistance is near more specific conclusion because we know the number of strain is not good enough. For example, although from the Papua only 7 strains, we use only some 13 strains. It's also Sumatra 80 strains, although in Java, although in Bali only 6 strains. So it is need the more further study to see the really H. pylori antibiotic resistance map in Indonesia. So why we try to make tested for 94 Indonesian strain using 5 new regimens: furazolidone, citalfloxacin, garenoxacin, rifaximin, and rifabutin, because we think that because we found that some area had the high prevalence of H. pylori, and also we never know how about rifabutin and also furazolidone. However, that Professor Graham also mentioned to me about some issue, for example, about the risk of the cancer, some of the drug in here. So it is also become the big problem for us. However, we can see that the furazolidone and also rifabutin and garenoxacin and also citalfloxacin is the most probably hope for us, especially if we have the citalfloxacin and also rifabutin. And we can see based on the locations that only the Papua has a problem with rifaximin, and for citalfloxacin and also rifabutin is the perfect, and also furazolidine in this part. And although if we compare based the ethnic, the furazolidine and rifabutin and citalfloxacin is also except the garenoxacin in especially in Chinese ethnic, and also rifaximin in the some area. Probably the three of the antibiotic is the most powerful to as the alternative or eradications. So if we compare the fluoroquinolone antibiotic based on the location, we found that the levofloxacin and garenoxacin had still have some impact of resistance in the some area. However, probably citalfloxacin probably is the most powerful in here. And about genetic mutation, we mentioned some of them. I tried to show. However, probably it is need more analysis to know what the next to Indonesia. So with this result, we know that furazolidine, probably citalfloxacin, and also rifabutin, and also we can see how compared with Japan and also Korea, actually our clarithromycin is still good enough, still 9.1%, and also amoxicillin, and of course the tetracycline probably is become the future drug for us. However, we can see some Indonesia had the higher gastric cancer risk. For example, we can see in here in the red color is high risk area based on the gastric cancer risk. So probably, as I mentioned the previous slide, the government has to have to special policy to give the really attention and also special consideration and special so policy to minimally treat these three areas. And we know this three area is also especially the South Sulawesi is the one of the populous population in Indonesia. So I think it is also very important to explore this area, because we know we never touch Maluku or Mollusca area, and also some area in this part. So probably I mentioned I predicted actually this triangle between the Sulawesi and also Timor and in this Papua Island is the one of the important area for the study H.pylori, except also in addition in this area, because in this area only the Batak ethnic had 40% prevalent H.pylori compared to 2.8% of Indonesia. So with some note, we know that some empiric therapy with recommendations about concomitant, probably we can still thinking use it especially with the metronidazole low or intermediate nitroglicerol region area, probably hybrid. And also previously Professor Graham asked me to join study about bismuth. Fortunately, I heard that recently bismuth, some company try to entering our bismuth to Indonesia, and I show some drugstore, online drugstore had bismuth. However, I know that the bismuth still had the controversy in our Indonesian FDA, so probably we have to wait. But if the bismuth, we have bismuth in here, probably the bismuth, and also we had low prevalence of tetracycline, probably it is very good choice, and also some new bismuth that mentioned, and also with the metronidazole and bismuth tablets because they had also recently prepackaged bismuth quadruple therapy. How about the triple therapy with clarithromycin? If we mentioned previously that probably in the some areas still in the outside of Java Island, of course. And of course, the furazolidone, if the tetracycline, probably we can try. Although furazolidone have the problem because some of the, we know the furazolidone in Indonesia is usual use in the fish and some animals to do the some factory to use the furazolidone is very massive. So I'm not sure in the future of furazolidone. However, we know rifabutin is probably the good choice. However, we have the problem because we know also that Indonesia is very high prevalence with the tuberculosis, and also rifabutin is the salvage treatment for tuberculosis. So it is also become our big problem. So, and I think we previously try probably, as I mentioned, 25% of Indonesia had dyspepsia with the low H.pylori. So probably we're thinking, probably it's gastric microbiota. And although we found some analysis, the result of the microbiota, however, actually to tell the truth, it is same with the most result in the world, that consistent pattern that Actinobacter, Bacteroidetes, and Firmicutes, and also Streptococcus is the predominant genus in the gastric. So, but with the next generation sequence research by metagenomics, we can probably spiritly the what kind of the species of Streptococcus. However, we still analysis especially how the lactobacillus influence truly in the gastric dyspepsia or gastritis. Thank you very much for today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miftah. It's very interesting presentation also, because Indonesia has a very unique feature of Helicobacter pylori. So I think we are coming to the question and answer session, or the discussion session. Professor Graham, can you join us again for this session? May you activate your camera? Okay, there you are. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us again. Okay, so we have a question, number of questions. This is a very interesting question. So I will start it with Professor Graham. Good morning, Professor. The Helicobacter pylori is an infectious disease that has a clear evidence and urge to eradicate to reduce the risk of gastric cancer. Okay, we are agree on that. But there is some theory that Helicobacter pylori infection could regulate the TH1 and TH2 modulation for allergic. Does this beneficial become a drawback for us as a clinician to eradicate HP infection? Thank you.
That's been several hypotheses about why we shouldn't do this, but the data suggests that there are no contraindications and no benefits to have H. pylori infection. And one could look at that even in Indonesia. I mean, you take an area in Indonesia that has no Helicobacter, or almost no Helicobacter, and if you looked at the hypotheses, they'd all be fat, and they'd all have asthma and allergies and in terrible shape, but they're not. So when you look at the population who has a lot of Helicobacter and a population who does not have any Helicobacter, you find out on average the ones with no Helicobacter are, at least all these peripheral things, are in much better shape. And so there's just no evidence to support that. People probably could find a reason to support tuberculosis if they looked.
Actually, I had the publication with Professor Graham in Frontiers in Microbiology, and we also already explained the probably is the beneficial of H. pylori is without evidence, and we still believe that if every H. pylori has to eradicate, and because no benefit to give the H. pylori.
Okay, so still no benefit and still the little enemy for us, but big enemy, yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Professor. Now for the next question, we have a question for you, Dr. Miftah. Okay, so Dr. Miftahusuru, why Indonesia has distinctive feature in promoting gastric cancer incident? Does our use of antibiotic has connection with it? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So previously, all the theory that, as I mentioned before I starting to study H. pylori, all people believe that the different prevalence of H. pylori is due to the antibiotic abuse in Indonesia. However, is it true that although in Medan, for example, we get the more than 40% in there, is it true the Medan people less consume antibiotic than Javanese? Is it true? Although, for example, is it true the Sulawesi less consumption of antibiotic? How about the Papua? How about the Timor? We cannot explain the gastric cancer risk or related with prevalence of H. pylori by antibiotic consumption. So why in our first study we believe with the 5 methods, we believe that the H. pylori is not about antibiotic resistance. It is about the ethnics. So why recently we write about the human migrations paper cooperation with Germany and also South Africa, and mention that H. pylori in Indonesia, some are zero prevalence, especially in Malay ethnic. It is about actually the genetics associated with the susceptibility to get H. pylori, like that probably. So if the gastric cancer area is different, I think number one, it is true related with H. pylori because South Sulawesi is high prevalence H. pylori, Papua is high prevalence H. pylori. However, how about Timor? Timor is intermediate, probably only 20%. However, this area is the highest gastric cancer risk index in Indonesia. So why recently I always in every conference, in every meeting, always mention we have to focus, especially in east part of Indonesia, especially the Timor area, because it is not only about H. pylori. Probably another factors why the number of gastric cancer, no, I mean gastric cancer, I mean atrophic gastritis, and also ulcer is very high. We have to wait the result of the study. However, it's really reduces our power due to pandemic. Thank you very much.
When you look at in Indonesia, where the populations have lots of gastric cancer, do they correlate with where the Dutch and other people came long ago and contaminated the population?
Yeah. How about the Dutch influence? Yes, Professor, you mean?
I'm just saying that, they brought, they came in, they killed people, they spread their bacteria.
Yes. Although, however, I previously I believe that we know that actually this is one theory and that I'm really appreciate to Professor Graham that mentioned the theory probably 10 years ago that there was no H. pylori from beginning in the Malaysian. However, so I previously I believe that the H. pylori imported due to the Dutch colony. However, after we analyze the genotype and also by the MLST and also next generation sequence, we found that the only Bali area in the near Bali area is related with the Western countries. However, the other area actually influenced a lot by East Asian type H. pylori, probably related with the Southeast or East Asian country, and also part of the mostly really uh, from the beginning from H. pylori, original H. pylori in some ethnic. For example, in the Batak, they have very specific H. pylori. Papua have a very specific H. pylori with the special M region. They have the M3 region. There was no M3 region. I tried to check, and also they really have the special six base pair deletions, and also in the MLST we can see very clearly they come from around 48,000 years ago by analysis the human migration. So probably is the Dutch colony is not the key. However, from beginning, it is the several wave of human migrations. So part of the ethnic had special respect.
There's two questions on there. There's two issues there. One is that is a population, and the second one is a diet. Because if you live in a mountain and you don't have fresh fruits and vegetables year round, then you get atrophic gastritis and gastric cancer. And so even in a country like Colombia, which has very high gastric cancer, it's very low on the coast, but it goes up when you go up in the mountain. And Papua New Guinea is a mountainous area. So you worry about that it's a diet issue. And even the most interesting piece of information came from Malaysia during the communist uprising, because the local tribes that lived out in the wilderness didn't have Helicobacter. So then the government rounded them all up and put them into camps so that the communists couldn't get supplies from them. And very poor conditions, and they got Helicobacter. So they went from almost none to almost all. And after the communist situation was over and they scattered again and came back to their normal lifestyle, their Helicobacters went away. So it was, or largely, so it's something to do with lifestyle and diet that is very important. Now we know that lifestyle and diet and salt intake and fresh fruits and vegetables are very important if you're infected, whether you get gastric cancer or don't get gastric cancer, or whether you get atrophy or don't. But we have nothing that we know about that is a practice that people do that leads to loss of Helicobacter, but obviously it occurs. And so we tried to study it, but there was no one like you over there that actually did hands-on studies. And so if you tried to do the studies from your chair, you rarely get, or from books, you rarely get the right answers. So there are many questions that, because of these different populations, that can be asked, and I expect that over time you will answer them.
Thank you, Professor Gam. I read many your review paper, especially about the impact of the diet and also lifestyle. So why very interesting in the Timor Island that because the H. pylori in there is not so high, it is very the best region to learn gastric cancer in this area. And also after I come back from US, actually, Dr. Judith, I received several books from Professor Graham, and actually now it's very interesting to write part of the information of this book in my new paper about human migration. Thank you very much, Professor Graham.
Yeah, this is very interesting because Professor Graham said that, yeah, we believe that the infection is a combination between the host, the environment, and the agent itself. And Indonesia is, we are an island that have isolation area also, and we have mountains also. But the research from Malaysia, I haven't read it, but this is a very interesting because uh, the isolation population can have effect in Helicobacter pylori, but in Indonesia, the Papua, the highest risk for the or the incident rate for the pylori, they they also isolation, but the highest. And Dr. Miftah, how about the Nias Island? I mean, in the Sumatra near
Yes.
Batam. What island is that? It's also isolation, right? But they also have high.
But
Pylori.
those,
Actually, our
but they
we
were in the old days. Those were very big trade routes. I mean, people were going back and forth.
mm,
Everything was being shared, and so not the people lived up on top of the mountains. They were not involved as much, but there were big trade routes. No, it's you can't take today's world and put past history on it. But it's interesting if you go look at the Dutch records.
mm,
Take in Java,
mm,
and you look at the autopsies they did on the locals that were working on the plantations. They had atrophic gastritis
mm.
and gastric atrophy. So they
Yeah.
were eating Western diets. And there's published data. So there's much left to be discovered in books if you just ask those questions. And the Dutch, I was very surprised when I went to see what the histopathology was in those populations, and I found out that they had, corpus atrophy. I said, "Oh, shouldn't have that," but you have to deal with what you have and then try and explain it. But most hypotheses are incomplete.
Yeah, yeah. That's why I still need
That's
research.
why we have hypotheses, so we can do experiments.
Yes, that's right. Okay, very interesting. Now we will move on to another question, Professor. I think this is now for the professor time. This is from Putri Amalia. Excuse me. Comedy, can there's a sound that is leak. Okay. Uh, Thank you very much for your incredible presentation, Professor. My name is Putri Amalia from Brawijaya University, Indonesia. I have a question for you. In this era of microbiota, okay, well, we are moving it. It can be possible that it is not only pylori that causes gastric cancer. What is your point of view about it? Thank you.
Uh, Microbiota is a very interesting area because if it's been studied actually since the 1890s, and we have a paper for last year or so ago with Laura Engstrom in Digestive Diseases and Sciences, where we give the history, and we point out that at least in that paper we can find no evidence for anything else besides Helicobacter.
Mm.
But if you look at those early studies, they noted that one of the things that always was present in the stomach is fungi.
Mm.
And so when Muhammad shows us his data on Helicobacter in the stomach, he doesn't show me any fungi or viruses. So it's like trying to look in a room with no lights. So we're just collecting data, but the data that I would, if they want that paper, you can just send me an email. I'll send it to you, or you can get it from Digestive Diseases and Sciences. But it gives you the whole history and what's been done. The remarkable things have been done, and most of the people who work in this area have never read what's been done, and so they did it over and over again, and they usually found the same answers, but not always. But there are no data that anything besides Helicobacter is involved. But we haven't looked at all these other things like fungi.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Nice. Okay, next question for Dr. Miftah. Dr. Miftah, mostly the antibiotic can cause dyspeptic symptoms also. If the anti-nauseatic or antiemetic already been used, but the patient still suffer from dyspeptic, what we should do? Only just quit the just quit the antibiotic, or another regimen is added. Thank you.
Yes, actually, we had this big problem about it, and some consultation from the internal medicine specialists come to us because they still try to use levofloxacin, although levofloxacin is not benefit in the Java Island. However, several patients come to me with the serious complaint about the use metronidazole and also levofloxacin. So in this patient, I think we have to really thinking the special regimens, especially probably we have to not use the metronidazole and also levofloxacin. So I hope in the outside of Java we can still use the clarithromycin. However, probably we have to wait a moment about the bismuth possibility to enter here, because with bismuth probably we can solve many problems, especially due to this antibiotic used. However, probably is also we can thinking about tetracycline. However, the base, I mean the evidence about the tetracycline as the uh, not additional, I mean is the main treatment is still lack evidence. I think I have to ask to Professor Graham about that, because although tetracycline is very good for quadruple non-bismuth, however, how about if they use tetracycline as triple therapy? I think it is not enough evidence. How about your suggestion, Professor?
No, I agree that the only proven use of tetracycline is with the bismuth quadruple therapy. Otherwise, it's about a 50% cure rate. Yes. And so it doesn't work. And doxycycline doesn't work. And so, but the Vaniprosium amoxicillin, if that works out, has really low side effects. I mean, you talk side effects, you have furazolidone. That's really tough to take. It's an MAO inhibitor, it interacts with a lot of drugs. So people have to be tough to take that.
As Professor Graham mentioned in his slide, I think the combinations with amoxicillin that we are also very low resistance, and also probably Vaniprosium will come this year, Professor Graham, in Indonesia. So probably it become a very good choice.
Yeah, it's approved in Indonesia, they say.
Yes, it's already approved, however, still not, I mean, distribute well in our country.
Well, one of the problems is that when you compare it to other PPIs for GERD, for healing peptic ulcer, it's no different. So if it costs more, then why use it? But for H.pylori, it's better. So that's a one spot that it's really got an advantage. So every new drug costs more. So the problem is, if I can buy esomeprazole for 50 cents or 10 cents, why would I use a $7 drug?
Professor Graham, how about the Vaniprosium with bismuth? How about that?
We don't know. The thought is that bismuth should be less effective with that.
Oh, yes,
because you need bismuth oxychloride. But we did a study, not with that, but with raising the pH high, and it showed it probably didn't make any difference. So it probably will be effective. But you don't need it if you have a dual therapy that works.
No. Okay, thank you. It's also answered some of the question here about the, there are some attendees that answer about the combination between the Vaniprosium and the bismuth. Yeah, I think we'll see about that, Professor. Okay, thank you. And the next question is for Professor Graham. Professor, is very interesting lecture. My question is, ideally, we give susceptible antibiotic. But sometimes we have to wait for the susceptibility test that can take some time. Is there any test or invention in the world that can inform us about the susceptibility or the resistance faster, or maybe a new invention that can inform specific strain of pylori that resistant to some antibiotic right away after we did the endoscopy? Thank you.
Well, two answers to that. One is with the molecular tests, you can get them back in 72 hours.
72, 2 days.
But the more important question is the person was infected as a child.
Oh, yeah.
So they were age 6 when they got infected. They come to see you at age 36, and you say you have to cure them after the endoscopy. They've already had disease for 30 years. I mean, let's have a little patience here.
That's right. Okay.
And the best thing to know is in your practice, you treated the last 30 patients with this regime that all got well. They have the same drug history as this. That would be the therapy.
Yeah. Okay.
But you need those data. So you need to collect and use those data.
Okay, have a little bit patient there, and Dr. It's okay then. Thank you. Okay, next question for Dr. Mehta. I think this already been discussed, but let's try to have a look to this question. Thank you, Dr. Miftahusuru, for your great presentation. As I know that gastric ulcer may cause by H. pylori infection, okay, poor hygiene, stress, and also spicy food. Okay, Indonesia is place or spicy food. Professor, have you tried our sambal? Not yet. Okay. In your presentation, Dr. Miftah, the incidence of gastric ulcer in Indonesia is lower than in Japan. Okay. How could this happen? As we know that Japan has better hygiene as developed country, and Japanese food is not spicy like Indonesian food. Is there another factor which causes gastric ulcer, or maybe the incidence of gastric ulcer in Indonesia is lower was due to the lack of diagnosis? Okay, so hygiene, spicy food, and lack of diagnosis. How about that, Dr. Mita?
How about sake? Actually, we know that environment, of course, for example, the hygiene is also really influenced to H. pylori prevalence. For example, Japanese, as the this is my first paper that I read during I learned H. pylori by Professor Graham and also Professor Yamaoka, that after World War II, and then they increased their hygiene. Actually, the prevalence H. pylori also become lower and lower, and probably we can have the era that H. pylori truly disappear from the world actually. And why I explained before that although when we in our first publication we mentioned that the water and also sanitations is influenced on the H. pylori prevalence in Indonesia. However, because from beginning, the most predominant ethnic with zero or no H. pylori or very, very low H. pylori. Therefore, the impact of the hygiene we can see only in the region with high H. pylori area. For example, why in the Papua it is become significant rather than, and also in Medan rather than another area. However, to tell the truth, this result is have the bias, because the prevalence positive is only in some area, and this area is the worst condition of the environment. So why this become positive? So when we try to make these methods to use in Java Island or in the Sumatra with the more hygiene area, the result is not so influenced by the environment. Because from beginning, as I explained, that some ethnic had no H. pylori, although the Batak had 40%. However, only several kilometers, although they living together. Aceh, Aceh is the next province after North Sumatra, is truly zero H. pylori. Although in there, many Batak also living in there, but there was no H. pylori. So the next study about the susceptibility to receive H. pylori is very important in Indonesia.
I'm not sure.
How about the
Okay,
Professor
bring
Gama?
it up, Professor. We
Well, I
like
think
to hear your
you have to look at the water supply,
water
Yes.
because
supply.
everywhere water is important, and some people in Indonesia and Bali get their water because it comes down from the mountain and they can dip it up, and other people get it from other sources.
I have studied, Professor Graham, that it is very interesting result actually, that the prevalence of H. pylori in North Sumatra is become higher and higher in the around Toba Lake. Toba Lake is the famous lake in Indonesia and in the world based on the volcano. However, near this lake is very the highest prevalence pylori. So we have the theory probably the high area in there is the probably because this lake water. However, we still had to find a good researcher to prove this theory.
Well, I'll tell you who to work with. But no, if you look at, for example, there was a study in Bolivia where they went to these villages and they did an epidemiologic study, and they gave them gifts because they participated in a study. And the gift was a water bottle that they could carry down to get water and bring it back to the house. And they found that there was a marked reduction in transmission to children. And when they looked at the reason was the water bottle had a narrow mouth and you couldn't put your hand in it. And that markedly reduced transmission. So it was another change of water source. In the same way, in those countries, they can grow, not just find, but grow Helicobacter from the drinking water. Or in Colombia, if you swim in a river, you're going to be infected. Or if you live in a village, if you live in a big city, let's say, and now in Peru, Lima, and you were very poor, and the poor people lived in the Pueblo Jovens, and they all had Helicobacter. The same people, very, very poor, that worked in the rich part of town, lived in very poor shacks, but they got their water from the wells that the rich people got it from. Remarkably lower frequency of Helicobacter. Now, when you talk about Papua New Guinea, I mean, there are whole chapters and books about the people that live there and how different they are, and their different diets, and they don't interact, and what the neighbors that came by, it happened 3,000 years ago. So that's a unique space because it was on a trade route. But when you talk about Japan, to have a gastric ulcer, you have to have atrophic gastritis, because as long as the H. pylori inflammations in the antrum, you don't get gastric ulcers. You have to have the disease progress, and it only progresses when you have periods of low acid. And you don't have low acid if you have a good diet. And one of the reasons that what's the best thing in the diet is vitamin C. And what contains vitamin C? Well, many spices contain vitamin C. Chili peppers, 4 grams of vitamin C it's 4 milligrams of vitamin C per gram. In fact, they first grew vitamin C isolated from chili peppers. So it's the spicy food is good for the stomach. But it just, in fact, we did studies. I have a paper where we did endoscopy after even spraying chili peppers on the stomach wall, and nothing happens. So as my roommate in college said, it hurts so good.
But chili pepper in a Western, the pepper is different
I know, but the spices are frequently vegetable things that are full of vitamins.
They near the Mexico, they have the really chili, such as Indonesia.
Yeah, we have the capsaicin ones, but we took those around. The capsaicin ones got taken by the Portuguese everywhere.
Yes.
Okay.
So they're good for you.
Oh, oh yeah. So go for the chili food then. Okay. Thank you. I think the time already near end, so we proceed to the last question. This is for both of you. The first one is for Professor Graham. Again, this is amazing lecture. Uh, uh, is it rational to combine other PPI drugs if we doesn't have phonopresent to increase the efficacy, and thus the phonopresent can maybe had a suspicion to in causing gastric cancer? Okay, for Professor Graham first.
Well, we don't have any. First of all, it's not, no, you can't combine different PPI drugs.
Okay,
They're basically all work the same, and you can interchange them.
okay.
So all you're doing is changing the dose,
Mhm.
and you can't make the dose high enough to be effective because your stomach could overcome it early in the morning. The Vaniprosium, one of its side effects is high gastrin,
High gastrin, okay.
and it's not thought to be a problem, but there are people worry about gastrin, and
Mhm.
high gastrin is related to colon cancer, for example.
That's right, that's right. So other cancer,
So we don't know, but we think that there are no data that says that it has any carcinogenic potential itself.
okay, okay. Hopefully, this is a great new drugs. Okay, the
Hopefully.
last one is for Dr. Miftah. Dr. Miftah, based on your experience in treating pylori in Indonesia, do you suspect the pylori infection on dyspeptic patient based on ethnicity or based on their area of the resident? And why we still have to be aware with pylori infection if the incidence of the gastric cancer also low in our country? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is very good question. So with our study that we found that although some Japanese living in the North Sumatra, this is the high prevalence of H. pylori area. However, only few of them, only one of them actually, although we have many, only one of them had H. pylori, and H. pylori is come from Bataknis ethnic because the H. pylori is very specific characteristic. And also in addition, in Java area, if we got the Javanese ethnic in Surabaya, for example, they mostly is negative H. pylori. But if we found Batak ethnic or some another ethnic, we found that they have a pylori with their original H. pylori. So therefore, uh, I think it is we have to eradicate based on ethnic, not region, because I have evidence that although uh, the Japanese move to other part or other place in the some area, they never become infected with H. pylori. This is the evidence that what I got. So I suggested ethnics is more important than regions. And the second, probably it is a very, to tell the truth, is not a good news for me, especially although I already done with H. pylori. However, I just know, H. pylori very low in my country. However, we have the some region with the high prevalence pylori, high gastric cancer risk, but still not. I mean, we still never analyze in this population. Still not invention, I think. So why I always try to give the information to our government, give special policy is special policy, and we have to really study hard in this is part area of Indonesia. I think it become our future study and focusing study in the, probably the next paper about the one in the eastern part had higher prevalence and also higher gastric cancer risk soon published. I think I hope it will also give many information to our doctor and also researcher. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, so I think we already reached to our end of our session. This is a very great discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Graham. This is a very honor to us. It's a big honor for us in Indonesia here to having you, and I'm very sure this is going to be a fruitful for every attendees here. And thank you, Dr. Muhammad Miftahusuru. Even though you are very busy, you're still willingness to give us and share your knowledge. Okay, so for the next session, the last session, we would like to make a quick a documentation. So please, for all the attendance, you may open your video or your camera to be able to take our photo session. Okay, I think so. For speaker and attendees, okay, we can be you can capture it. Okay, I will try to capture it. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Give your big smile. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you once again, Professor Graham, for your time. I think it's already very late night there in USA, and I hope I don't bother you at all. Okay, and thank you again for Dr. Miftahusuru. Thank you for our speaker. And thank you for all participants, and to all the participants, we would like to take a moment to completing our satisfaction survey we sent to the chat of the in the chat box, and we encourage all participants to fill the questionnaire, and then the certificate will be sent to your email. And once again, thank you so much for joining our workshop today. Don't forget, we have still one more session in this afternoon session, and it's around 11:30 with our speaker also, Dr. Wei Chi Lau from Taiwan, and also Dr. Firman Setiawan in 11:30 a.m. This afternoon. Don't miss it. It's also interesting. And once again, my name is Judith Anissa. I'm sorry for any inconvenience may occur during this workshop. We have you had a great time with us. Don't forget to join us again for this second session. And stay healthy and stay safe for everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Professor Graham, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
See you soon.
See you.